A hush fell upon the crowd. Hi, everybody. We're all wondering if it's snowing yet out there. I'm Matthew Scott. I'm president of the Carnegie Institution for Science, and I'm here to welcome you and to express my excitement, both at the continuing level of interest in these lectures we have. No surprise tonight, given our speaker, but it's wonderful to see people braving the conditions or the conditions that are purported to be out there to join us. So welcome. 3 months ago, we hosted a panel of astronomers who discussed the discovery over the last 20 years of thousands of exoplanets in the Milky Way. Many of these planets orbit stars in habitable zones. It's tempting to imagine that at least some of them have blue oceans and green forests and, since I was just in Antarctica, penguins, and that they are populated by creatures that resemble those that are found here on Earth. But when scientists talk about a planet being in a habitable zone, they mean only that the planet is at a distance from its star where it could potentially harbor life. That generally means that the planet could support liquid water at its surface. The concept of habitable zones has evolved since the term was first introduced in the 1950s, but follow the water has always been the mantra of scientists seeking life beyond Earth. You could say follow carbon too, as Pam was telling me earlier. While living beings here on our planet require different organic molecules and different sources of energy, they all require water, what has rightly been called the elixir of life. Scientists have shown us in recent years that water is abundant in the universe. Water is found in comets and asteroids and in dwarf planets like Ceres. Water exists in giant molecular clouds, in tiny particles of interstellar dust, in disks of newborn planetary systems, and in the atmospheres of giant planets. In our own solar system, Earth is not the only body with abundant water. Oceans of liquid water likely exist beneath the surfaces of 5 icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Ganymede alone might contain more water than Earth does. And only a few months ago, NASA confirmed that briny liquid water can exist on the surface of Mars, where scientists think millions of years ago, water filled an ocean more than a mile deep. Water might be the foundation of life, and its presence the first step in looking for life beyond Earth, but it takes more than water for life to emerge. Assessing life's requirements elsewhere is not an easy task. The Earth provides a stunning diversity of life and presents habitable environments as extreme as some in space. But as Bob Hazen told us here 2 months ago, ours is a unique planet with a unique interacting assemblage of minerals and biology. Learning about the chemical reactions that occur on other extraterrestrial bodies is thus essential in learning whether the potential for life there might exist. Understanding mineral differentiation and evolution is a primary goal of astrobiologists. Among them, our guest tonight, Dr. Pamela Conrad, who monitors a suite of instruments aboard an extraordinary little vehicle called Curiosity that has been rambling around Mars' Gale crater for over 3 years. An amazing feat, apart from anything else. Dr. Conrad is a mineralogist and astrobiologist with the Planetary Environments Laboratory at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. Her prime interests are in the development of approaches and measurements for assessing habitability in planetary surface environments. This includes the development of non-invasive optical methods and in situ chemical analyses of potential rock targets. Currently, she is Deputy Principal Investigator and Investigation Scientist for the sample analysis at Mars Instrument Suite aboard the Curiosity rover. She is also co-investigator to 2 different payload investigations for the Mars 2020 mission. Dr. Conrad received all of her degrees, a bachelor's and master's in music, a master's in geology, and a PhD in mineralogy from the George Washington University. She spent 11 years at Caltech's Jet Propulsion Laboratory as an astrobiologist, exploring extreme environments on Earth, and I just heard about some of those adventures tonight, really wonderful, and preparing for the Mars Science Laboratory mission before joining NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in 2010. She's no stranger to the Carnegie Institution. During her predoctoral years at George Washington, she served as a fellow at Carnegie's Geophysical Laboratory, one of our vibrant departments located quite close to here, and that's where she performed her PhD research in high-pressure mineral physics. She stayed on at the lab as a postdoc for 2 years and then returned later as a visiting investigator. So we've been benefiting from her in a recurrent fashion, and tonight we welcome her back as one of the world's premier experts in the evolution of habitable worlds. So please join me in welcoming Pamela Conrad.
Not much pressure. Thank you. It's good to be home. When I was at the Geophysical Laboratory, I had quite a trio of people helping me navigate my way through graduate school: Bob Hazen, Russ Hemley, and Dave Mao. And one thing that Dave Mao said to me early on has stuck with me, and that was, there are a lot of interesting problems that you could study, and really you should pick the biggest, most interesting one to address. And so now I'm in a lot of trouble all of the time because I pick such big questions to investigate. I can't solve them. And so I'm going to share one with you tonight and invite you to help me think about habitability, try on some new ideas that have implications beyond whether or not a planet has water or whether it has carbon. I'm going to do this a little bit backwards tonight, and I'm going to give you my email address first so that you have time to write it down, and if we don't get a chance to address all the questions, do write me. I promise you I'll answer. I can't promise it will be promptly within the hour, but it will certainly be within a day or two. So one of the things that I have learned as I have been exploring Mars is that really, I think this is the coolest planet. And this is not an image that is created. This is a photographic image. And in actuality, it's got a depiction of an event that happened a few years ago, another Mageddon-type weather event. You can see Hurricane Irene just off to the right of Florida on the East Coast. In order to try to understand a cryptic planet, one that doesn't seem like it's very hospitable for life, it's important to ask ourselves, what about this planet is so hospitable? In fact, it's really difficult on this planet to find a place devoid of life to get a blank as a control, either for testing the development of technologies that would help us look for the presence of life, or to try to figure out what the signature of an environment is as distinct from the signatures of life. So as we look at Mars and we try to figure out if it is habitable now or if it ever has been habitable, I try to always keep in mind what I know about the Earth and what I don't know about the Earth so that I can refine the set of questions that we might ask about Mars. One of the things that is important to point out has to do with the ways in which we can ask ourselves about environments. I often refer to this as extraterrestrial real estate assessment, because habitability as a potential is kind of an airy-fairy concept. It's one that's hard to nail down. We think in terms of requirements for life. Life needs this, life needs that, and we have some idea of some of those requirements, but we don't have the complete set. If we kind of turn that question around and we try to think about what the requirements of the environment are that might host life, it's a slightly different cast to the question. And the reason why that is an important distinction is because if you go to a planet where you don't have obvious life, or you go somewhere that has life that is so beyond what our expectation is, having grown up with life on this planet, we might not see it. We might not recognize it. But one thing that we have learned from our studies of meteorites that are samples from other planets, from things that we have now measured in situ on Mars, we see that the same set of chemical elements is consistent throughout the observable universe. These chemical elements are reliable in forming the minerals, the solid material that makes up planets, and the light element inventory of things that can be processed by biology or that can act upon the geologic environment. This stuff is a little bit predictable. It's not exactly predictable by thermodynamics because we have that nasty little problem of kinetics that really determines whether chemical reactions will go or not go. And life, because of its happy faculty of helping reactions go or not go, really obscures the natural state of chemistry that would happen on a planet if life were not there. So if we think about what environments do in the absence of life, it's a little bit easier to think about habitability potential of just the environment as distinct from life. So when I look out at an environment like this, which I have been doing for about 3 years, this is an environment in Gale Crater where Curiosity lives presently. Really, the top question in my book is about the present moment. And what I want to know is, can anything live here now? So I'm going to cut to the chase right here and tell you, my hypothesis is no, not on the surface. Now, I realize that sounds a little bit like I'm hedging, and especially in a political election season, it doesn't sound like a straight answer. And that's to tell you that I have hopes that it's possible that we might have subsurface life. But right now we're on the surface, and it's a pretty nasty place for a couple of reasons, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And I personally don't think there's life on the surface. There might be life in the subsurface. I'm going to talk about the past in a little while. I want to get back to this question of what are the type of things that we might want to know about an environment to determine if something can live there. When you go looking for a home, you might have some idea. Say you're a student, you want it to be close to the school. Say you work for the government and you get snowstorms often and you want to be able to get to work when Metro decides to shut down. These are considerations that are so obvious to us in this environment, they're kind of no-brainers. But as we get to finer and finer levels of distinctions and more basic things, the kinds of chemical requirements for life and the kinds of physical requirements for life, these are a little more cryptic. We tend not to think they're cryptic because this is the kind of stuff that we have here. And to ask ourselves why or if anything can live in a harsh environment, we've really got to go to the very clement environment that we've become used to on Earth. There is so much life everywhere on Earth, it's very difficult to study the environmental signature of just rock or just atmosphere without the contribution of biology. So it's a difficult problem, and even if you go to a place where there's somewhat less fecundity, the questions still are really not that hard to ask and answer. If you take a look at this, the square is not naturally occurring. It's the result of my hiking boot. But you might want to ask yourself, what is that ridge line there with the scrub stuff? And what is this one little tree doing in this one spot? You can see that what you're looking at is a floodplain when you're there. This is Amboy Crater in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. And so you know it's a wash, and you know that periodically it's inundated. And so you think that stuff gets carried down, rubble, rocks, gravel, seeds, spores, and all sorts of things. Why is this one little scrub bush in this one spot? I don't know the answer to that. So I try to break down these questions of what makes an environment habitable into different kinds of factors that we've got to consider. And this is something that we can all do, from someone who is very young to someone who is very old. I count myself among the people approaching the latter category rapidly. And we start usually with chemistry. And we ask ourselves, what does life need? And you already heard life needs water. And that's a fairly broad consensus. There are other kinds of chemical requirements, and we think that a habitable environment might need certain specific building blocks. You heard me mention carbon a little bit earlier. You also know that there are trace elements that we use as humans, and there are all kinds of elements that microbes use. There are a whole set of things that living things can use, and we think that in this chemical soup, they can then conduct the business of metabolism. When we think this way, we tend to get focused a lot on chemistry, and then we forget there might be other things. And there are other things. And these are physical requirements. So my number one priority for tonight is to help us spin the air around in our head a little bit and think about the physics of habitable environments and what that might mean for the planets in our solar system, for our planet, and for Mars. So first of all, there's location. We heard a little bit about habitable zones being places that are distances from stars where liquid water could exist. But there are other things. There are factors like the size of the planet. The size of the planet could determine quite a few things, not the least of which is what gravitational force it might exert on its nearby neighbors. If you end up too close to competing forces, it's bad news for you. If you end up just in the right spot so that you can use tidal forces to invigorate the planetary interior, that might be good news for you as a planet. The dynamics of the environment. If you are on the side of a mountain and you are just at the angle of repose where stuff keeps falling down, it can be a very dynamic environment. And so, for example, clinging vegetation doesn't do well there. In fact, if you go to areas in hill terrain and mountains, and you see these alluvial fans where the rubble runs down as water washes down, what you will see is the rubble in the fan, and then just along the edge of the fan where the water collects in channels, that's where you'll see the green stuff. And that's because it's too mechanically unstable on the rubble fan. So that is a factor. There's also stuff like temperature. It's not just about water. It's about the swings in temperature. Do you get very cold at night and very hot during the day? It's not a very good environment if you're trying to maintain chemical metabolism within a certain range, if you're going too much up and down like this. Then there is the larger sense of dynamics. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some catastrophic events that happened a long time ago, which Earth survived pretty well and Mars did not. And so that sort of celestial environment where you have asteroids or perhaps comets, other kinds of impactors happening at a regular frequency and with a large enough mass, it's fairly bad news for the planet. You can get complete remelting of the planet. So these things are sort of obvious to people who study planetary formation. They're less obvious to people who study the chemistry of life because we don't think about what I consider to be forcing functions of physics that might affect the ability for a place to be habitable. One other physical feature I want to talk about right now, and I'll get to a few more specifics about that soon, and that is that Earth has this best friend forever, which has helped stabilize its rotational period and also has helped it to survive the maelstrom of the late heavy bombardment, which Mars did not do, and that is we have this moon. And the Earth transfers angular momentum to the moon. We used to spin a lot faster than we presently do. As a function of that transfer of momentum, the moon gets further away from the Earth, and at some point it will get even further away than it is now, and our spinning will slow down a little bit more. That won't happen tonight. So that's just a quick trip through some of the physical features that might affect the evolution of a habitable environment. So let's get back to a direct comparison of Earth and Mars. So here are some obvious things. Earth is a lot bigger than Mars. Mars is only a little more than half the size of the Earth. Earth is warm, Earth is wet, Earth has a thick atmosphere. It's got, most importantly for my discussion on physics, It's got a dynamo on the inside that generates a magnetic field. The magnetic field is key to protecting the delicate chemistry of life from the horrible degradation due to galactic cosmic radiation and solar energetic particles. This is the nasty radiation that is just too energetic for life to sustain on a regular basis. Now, sadly, for Mars, it no longer has a dynamo in its interior. It has no plate tectonics, so it also does not allow you to exchange materials from the surface to the inside. Another set of bad news for Mars. It's mostly dry. It has some ice. It has mineral evidence of rocks that were formed in water, either as chemical precipitates or as what we call clastic sedimentary rocks, which are rocks that are glommed together, bits of older rocks, and then glued by stuff that you see emerging in a watery environment. And Mars has lots of temperature swings because it's got a very, very thin atmosphere. A lot of it has degassed. And that has been a theory for a long time. And one of the contributions that Curiosity has made is in determining how the isotopes of gases in the atmosphere, that is the light and the heavy versions of those gases, show us a ratio one to the other, which suggests that lots of atmosphere has gone away. As atmosphere goes away, the light version of a chemical element tends to escape, leaving the heavier version and changing the ratio of heavy to light. That's a signature that atmosphere is being lost, and that is the case for Mars. So there are some differences between Earth and Mars on the physical level. There are some chemical differences in terms of abundances, and you'll be happy to know that a lot of the basic rock-forming minerals that we see on Earth, the basalt that forms our islands and the oceanic crust, we see basalt on Mars, and we see more mature rocks, more evolved rocks on Mars. Now, I told you I'd tell you about a bad thing that happened a long time ago, this late heavy bombardment. And what happened was about 4.1 to 3.9 billion years ago, when the planets were really only formed for a few 100,000 years, just a ton of giant protoplanets, planetesimals that were good news when you're trying to form planets and bad news when they come flinging through the inner solar system, bashing into Earth, bashing into Mars, bashing into Mercury and Venus and so forth. So the deal is that Mars did not withstand that very well. And it is one theory that Mars lost its capability to generate a protective magnetosphere at this time. And it is also thought that the atmospheric loss that I spoke of happened very early. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So this late heavy bombardment period was a bad news period. Now, the question that I'd like to ask you is, does size matter in that regard? And I think it does, because there may be a certain minimal size that is required to recover from a really dynamic level of bolide impact. So that's just something to keep in mind. This particular artist, who I like to give a plug to, Don Dixon and Cosmographica.com, has been very generous. Whenever I give a talk, he gives me permission to use his images. He has some wonderful depictions on the Cosmographica website. And if you go there, you'll see some of his ideas about what the early Earth looked like, and a series of images that go from when we were getting impacted to when we began to get water to when things began to dry out and so forth. Cosmographica.com. All right, now, what I want to show you are some images of extremes. These are some extreme places that I have been to on Earth, trying to understand how, in the most challenging of environments, life does it, essentially. Some of these areas may be familiar to you. The image on the left of your screen is from Spatial volcano on Svalbard. A Carnegie principal investigator, Andrew Steele, led investigations there for 8 years, 7 years? How often did we go? For a lot of times. We went there and investigated mineral phases that are very similar to those that are seen in meteorites that come from Mars. And we also investigated the microbial life that lives in these relic volcanic tubes. This is a weathered, subglacially extruded volcano. The image on the top is Badwater Basin from Death Valley. And I go there to look at these dry evaporite fields, which are periodically inundated with water. And when that happens very quickly, you get thick layers of cryptoendolithic life living in things like carbonates and sulfates, which are quite thick, that you can just dig up and you'll see bright green and bright pink microbial mixed layered communities. The image on the bottom is from Antarctica, the McMurdo Dry Valleys. Now, this is called Battleship Promontory. It's a protected region. And in this area, there is no life save for the mixed-layered microbial communities that live just under the surface of the rock. These rocks were discovered years ago by Imre Friedman. And these mixed-layered microbial communities make their living in a really interesting way. In the dry valleys, there are these basalts. They're called dolerite. They have a lot of iron in them. And as the katabatic winds come down off the polar plateau and weather these rocks, these bits of iron, reduced iron, get transported on the wind, and they get deposited on some very coarse sandstones. And by coarse, I mean not just that grain sizes are big, but they have big pore spaces. And so what happens is the iron comes down on the top. You get some periodic amount of snow and ice on there. The iron gets oxidized by an upper layer of microbes, and the products tend to go down into the rock by diffusive action. And then there are heterotrophic microbes that eat the autotrophic microbes on the top. And then because of the large amount of pore space, the waste products just drain down into the rock. So this is an environment that's very difficult for other life to survive in, yet this life in the rocks does quite well. One enabling feature of that is a thermal feature. These rocks have a 30-degree temperature swing during the day in the Antarctic summer, and that is warm enough to keep those within a zone that's favorable. Out on the surface, you get a broader swing. Inside the rock, it's moderated. So that's something to keep in mind, again, the diurnal swing. Now, these are interesting images. One of these images is Mars, and one of these images is Earth. So in the is it real, is it Memorex vein, the top image is Mars. Opportunity got that image. And the bottom image is, again, in Svalbard. And that image, I'm sorry I didn't do image credits on these two because I just didn't want to give it away from the get-go. So that is JPL Caltech credit up at the top. And the bottom image is from Kjell-Ove Starvik, who is a freelance photographer who's accompanied us on many expeditions to Svalbard. So the point of my showing you this is to say, on the top, we don't see any evidence for life. We see evidence that this rock was deposited underwater, subaqueously, we call that, and it's sedimentary rock. And the story of that sedimentary deposition is recorded in that rock. So when you see things like layered bedding and ripples and so forth, those are stories that tell you that the rock was deposited in a particular way. And that's how we piece out what the environment of deposition was. In the bottom, these rocks also were deposited as sedimentary rock. And these layers of rock show something else that the top layers of rock don't. They have microbes in there. Now, these rocks have, we infer the composition of the rocks from Spirit and Opportunity by virtue of the types of spectroscopy that those rovers could do. So we did not do definitive mineralogy on Spirit and Opportunity, but we have pretty good evidence from the chemistry and what makes up the minerals, what we think those rocks are. The rocks on the bottom image, we did measure. We used a field prototype of the X-ray diffractometer that ended up going to Mars on Curiosity called CHEMIN. And so we know that the rocks on the bottom are similar to the kinds of rocks that we would see on Mars. And some of the rocks that we see in the rock on the bottom are contain mineral phases that are like mineral phases that we've seen on Mars in Gale Crater. So the whole point of this is to tell you that we make some of the same kinds of things that we make on Earth on Mars. I'm not talking about the specialty minerals, but in the basic rock-forming minerals. So if we have a lot of the same basic inventory of stuff available to us, why does Mars look like that and not like that picture I showed you earlier from a helicopter of the beautiful scene in Canada going out towards the Welland Glacier with the green trees and the mosses and the plants? This is what we get on Mars right now at Gale Crater. Now, there are a couple of reasons, and I've already given you hints about some of those reasons. Let's talk a little bit about this environment on Mars. Gale Crater is in about the most benign environment in terms of wild swings you can get on Mars. It's just about 4 degrees south of the equator. What's interesting about this environment for us was it has this huge central mound. And in that huge central mound, there are lots of layers of rock in there. So as you move up that mound, you can see different types of environments of deposition of sedimentary rock. And the sedimentary rock is like a history book, and we just pour through it looking at evidence of environments of deposition to tell us, was the planet habitable in the past? Is it habitable now? How has the environment changed? Has it not changed? And so that's why the scientific community voted to go to Gale Crater. You'll notice the kind of a black stripe. Let's see. See this oval here? That was the landing ellipse where we predicted we would land, but this black stripe is the thing I'm referring to. That's a dune field, and we are just beginning to explore the dune field, giving you a little preview of my closing message, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But we picked Gale Crater because it was just near the equator of Mars, and so it's a pretty stable environment. And we've been doing all kinds of things there, like measuring all the different kinds of minerals that we see, measuring all the different kinds of gases that are volatile or that might be driven off of rocks if we bake them. We've measured the atmosphere to get a look at its and the ratio of its major constituents one to another. We've measured the isotopes of different types of chemical elements that come in light and heavy versions in the atmosphere. And we've also measured the weather continuously. We have a very long-running record now of what the environment is like in terms of temperature, relative humidity, ground temperature compared to air temperature, and so forth. One of the advantages of having a comprehensive program of missions that explore is that we can use the data from one mission to help us plan another mission. When I go out into the field on Earth to look for evidence of a habitable environment, I can do a lot of things randomly, and I can go back and go somewhere else if I don't like what I see in the field placement where I am. On Mars, you can't do that. You're very limited because it's very expensive, and you're limited by technology, and you're limited by the challenging environment, and you're limited by the energy resources. We pack our own power supply and use it to charge batteries, and at some point, the power supply won't work anymore in the future. So we have to use all the resources we have to figure out where to go before we get there. And we did that with Curiosity using a variety of data from orbit. And some of the amazing things we have been able to find on Mars in Gale Crater were pointed out to us by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and by Odyssey, and by Mars Express, and by missions that went before that. So it's very important to understand that we all do science in the context of our ancestors. And so some of the measurements that Viking made a long time ago set the stage for the measurements we now make. The mass spectrometers that Viking set on the surface of Mars back when I was a Texas housewife, which is a long time ago, were amazing measurements. So it's very important to look at the whole context of all the measurements when you try to ask a question as big as what constitutes a habitable environment and if a planet is or is not habitable. So this is one of my favorite images because, of course, it's all about me. And there I am. And what happened was the HiRISE camera on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter got a picture of Curiosity rover investigating this rock here. And there we are in this box. Isn't that cool? It's on another planet. We were talking earlier, how did we find that? Isn't that awesome? All right, so where have we been and what have we been doing to look for evidence of habitable environments? So this is a map that shows where we were as of Sol 1221. Okay. It's about 10 days later now, so this is already out of date. No, just kidding. Actually, we haven't gone very far. We've done some minor adjustments in movement. But this is a list of some of the features that we've identified and explored as we have moved. And as I told you, we're right now looking at dunes. It's this black stuff here. And we've named the dune Namib Dune. And by the way, if you want to know more about what we're presently doing or even what we have most recently done, there are no deep, dark secrets. As soon as images come down from Curiosity, they're made available to the public. They're not, we don't have a chance to optimize the exposures and stuff like that. And you can get this on the NASA website, and I'm going to give you those links at the end of the talk. So we've been investigating along this path. We call these traverse passes. So we have a little bit of jigs and jags and things like that. And the reason why we do that is because sometimes we find hazards, sharp rocks or obstacles that we just can't get around, or patches of what look like quicksand, and we have to avoid those. So it's not exactly a straight line. And we're making our way through the dune field. We should be done in a couple weeks, and then we'll be continuing to make our way through the foothills up Mount Sharp. So I want to digress a little bit and talk to you about a paper that we published in 2013, just at the end of 2013, about our research in a place called Yellowknife Bay. And in Yellowknife Bay, we started to see all kinds of chemistry that suggested a much different environment in the past than we presently see. And Yellowknife Bay showed rocks that were definitely deposited underwater. And from the chemistry that we were able to see when we took samples of the rock, stuck it in our pyrolysis oven, and baked it and measured the chemistry of the gas, what we could see was that the pH, or the acid to base ratio, of the waters that formed the rock were probably pretty neutral. Our project scientist at the time, John Grotzinger, I believe he said, I would drink this water. Because the pH was pretty neutral. Now, I probably wouldn't drink this water for other reasons. I like to call Mars the Clorox planet. And there's a good reason for that, and that is we see evidence of a really oxidizing compound everywhere. It's kind of like somebody sprinkled OxyClean all over the surface of Mars. And so for that reason, I wouldn't be that interested in drinking Mars water, especially because, you know, we do all these antioxidant things to prevent our aging and decay. So I want to talk to you about this because when we published that paper, we found an environment that looked more clement than the present and had chemistry that told us the chemical environment of Mars was different in the past than it is now. And the reason why I'm kind of being a brat about this and saying it again and again is not to be cute, but to say that we've really got to look at the physics of this too. The chemistry suggested it could have been possible. We can't measure the physics of the past very well because we can see things like large grains or sorted grains or things that tell us a little bit about the dynamics of the environment of deposition, but other things we can't tell. So the sort of broad brush of how hot or cold it is when you can crystallize certain mineral phases, you can see. But the finer scale about day-night temperatures and whether or not the delicate chemistry that you need for metabolism could survive in that thermal environment, we don't know that. We don't know the radiation environment for sure. And we don't know other things like were there harsh winds that continuously abraded the surface of rock. So those are some of the kinds of physical things that we need to know. We don't know the electrostatic environment. Mars has a lot of electrostatic charge. And we see dust devils on Mars which show us that we vary that charge some. So we don't know the physics environment of the past. We don't know the spatial environment of the past. We see some chemicals in this spot in the crater, but you need to have all the stuff together at the same time. So the right stuff, yes, but the right stuff at the right time, more yes. So that's the temporal and the spatial aspects of that. Now, I'm going to break my rule about showing busy word slides because I want you to get the gestalt of something. And take home this message from this busy slide. Close your eyes and just hear the message here. In chemical requirements for life, they're tied to the chemical requirements of what the environment has to offer you. So we evolved to require certain things because when we came to be, that stuff was there. We made use of the materials. So if you look at this now, you can look. If you look at the biological abundance of oxygen, for example, which is up here, this is a very tiny dot, so you may not be able to see that. It's 65%. It's the most abundant biological element. And then you look at the crustal abundance, the most abundant element, oxygen. Now, here's where we get a little bit of a difference. You'll see in biological abundance, carbon, the second most abundant one. Crustal abundance, silicon. Now, here's the deal. So a lot of people want to know, can you have silicon-based life? And I remember when I used to read Superman comics that there was a villain from a planet named Mr. I think it was Mikyezpidalix. His name was all syllables. So I never did know how to pronounce it. And he was supposedly a silicon-based life form. So my answer to whether or not you could have silicon-based life is, I don't know, maybe. But the thing about this chart, the take-home message of it is, silicon is busy. Silicon is in rocks. And when you make minerals, what happens is you'll get one chemical element surrounded by a few friends that are tightly bound to it. They're in a really tight relationship. Sometimes the forces are so strong it's hard to break apart that geometric polyhedron. And that polyhedron comes apart as a chunk and then makes other minerals. So silicate rocks have silicate anions, and silicon is busy having a relationship with all these oxygens. So it's less likely that you would use it for life because A, it takes more energy to bust one of those bonds up than it would take to do a carbon one, and B, because of its configuration, it's harder to do what we call covalent chemistry, which is where you can buy and sell and share electrons, and life likes to make use of that kind of chemistry. So when you're thinking about the chemistry of environments and what you need to make an environment be a habitable place, it's not just the chemistry, it's also their properties at the temperature and pressure where you are. So on Earth, the properties may be a little bit different than on Mars. So some things that might be a gas on Earth are a solid on Mars, and some things that might be a liquid on Earth are a solid on Mars, and that makes them less available to engage in the mobility of life and chemistry. So, physical factors, I told you they mattered. I wanted to give you a little bit more of an idea of what some of these things are. Certainly, latitude is one of them. I made a big point that we were at the equator because you don't get as much variation. It's a more stable environment. Elevation, same kind of thing. Temperature, solar radiation. What is the wavelength of light that gets down? And what is the intensity of it? We are optimized to do photosynthesis on Earth to a specific wavelength of light. Our photoreceptors use that. Could you have a different one somewhere else? Yes, why not? So when you think about what Earth is like and what Mars is like, there's a very different photo environment, Mars has a lot of very energetic light getting through, including ultraviolet light, which is also energetic enough to bust up bonds. So these are some of the physical kinds of factors that affect the habitability of an environment. Here's a really cool measurement that was made very early in Curiosity's mission. So what you see is some red waves going kind of diametrically opposed to some blue waves, right? And what this is showing us the relationship between the atmospheric pressure on Mars and the amount of radiation that gets through. The take-home message of this plot is that when the atmospheric pressure is low, you get more radiation. So what we want to learn from that is that as the atmosphere has gone away, the intensity of ionizing radiation has picked up. So if we find a nice chemical environment where we might have water of relatively neutral pH, even if it has some, not Clorox, but other types of oxychlorines, that's not good enough just by itself. We also have to know whether or not we're having killer radiation flux. So let me just say a little bit about spatial requirements. The image on the left is from the Beacon Sandstone rocks at Battleship Promontory in Antarctica. And you can see some things about that rock that tell you the environment. These things are called crossbeds, and they tell you about the environment of deposition. And some crossbeds tell you that you've been deposited under air, and some crossbeds tell you that you were probably deposited underwater. And there's a lens cap here for scale, 55 millimeter lens cap. Now, that is the Beacon Sandstone, all of that. See this orangey stuff on the top? So remember I told you the top layer of bacteria takes that iron and it oxidizes it? So that's the oxidized iron after the bacteria have had their way with it. And they build up gases just underneath that top layer, and then the skin exfoliates off the top of the rock. So it first turns orange and then it peels off. It's kind of cool. If you look at an electron micrograph of that rock, which is what this image is here, this scale bar shows you 200 microns. Look at these holes. They look giant. Those holes are the pore spaces by which you bring in the nutrients so you can use them, and you excrete the waste products, and then the waste products diffuse away. You would be literally drowning in microbial poop if you didn't have enough pore space for it to, by gravity, diffuse away. So now I think I'm going to skip this one, and I want to show you something about the Clorox planet. So the important message from this is, yes, it is a hole, and it is to tell you we have drilled holes on Mars. This particular hole is a target called Buckskin in an area called Lion that we investigated in the summertime. And what I want you to notice is that the tailings from the drill are gray, and the rock to the side is relatively red, orangey really in this light. Oh, by the way, this little thing here is the pressure point from the drill stabilizing thing as we make a hole in the surface. So it's a powdering drill, and when the material comes up, it's gray. That tells you something. It tells you that it's less oxidized than the stuff on the top. So whether the stuff on the top is dust or whether the top layer of minerals that are in rock are being oxidized in place, it is oxidized. And so we measure with the different instruments that do surface chemistry on Curiosity. We have an alpha particle X-ray spectrometer that measures chemical elements. We have this really cool laser-induced breakdown spectrometer, which is a laser zappy thing that shoots out a bolt of infrared laser light, makes a little bit of plasma, and then analyzes the chemistry of it. So we can measure a slightly different set of chemical elements with that, and there's some overlap between these two instruments. Then we can measure the minerals with the X-ray diffractometer that I told you about, and the volatile chemistry with our instrument, the Sample Analysis at Mars suite, which is a mass spectrometer suite. So this is a very, very broad look at some of the things we've done to try to assess habitability potential on Mars. I didn't want to waste an opportunity to show you some new stuff. Right now, we're exploring a dune field. We want to understand all kinds of things. What is the dynamic of the dune field on Mars? Do dunes on Mars have higher humidity associated with them? What is the chemistry? Are the dune sands different kinds of minerals than in the dust, the really fine-grained stuff we see on Mars? And these are some of the questions that we're going to be asking. So as Curiosity has approached this slippy, slidey dune field, we did some things to make sure that the rover would be safe. One of the things we did was do what we call a toe dip. And then when we did a toe dip and measure the orientation of the rover, another thing we tried after that was a wheel scuff to see what can we uncover by just rotating the wheel but not moving the other wheels. You can individually command all 6 of the wheels on the rover. And so what you see there, that little trench, this kind of elbow-looking thing here, isn't that cool? That's part of the rover arm, the massive rover arm. And so just beyond that, this is the trench here. Look how fine this stuff is. Just looks really soft, like you'd like to play in it. So what we determined was it was very fine-grained stuff, and it had some larger grains. I didn't bring a picture today, a close-up of the grains, which I kind of regret now. But I wanted to show you something about the rover. When we want to look at materials without ingesting them into our, what we call the analytical instruments, the X-ray diffractometer and the mass spectrometer, we have this little area, this round thing, and these little squares. Those are fiducial marks to help us make measurements. We call that the O tray, or the observation tray. We want to just look at stuff. Sometimes we can get a good look at stuff, sometimes we can't, because there's a lot of wind on Mars, and so you can dump it down there, and by the time you rotate around what we call the cheese head, which is this, this rotary array of instruments on the wrist of the arm, you'll get significant blowing away. So we can't use it in areas when we're having high wind. So let me kind of wrap things up and get to the point where we have questions. And so what I want to say is that the status of the neighborhood right now, as I see it, is that the diurnal temperature minima are very low. And the swing that you get from cold to hot is kind of tough to allow life to metabolize. So I think the thermal environment is not right for life on the surface of Mars right now. The radiation doses at the surface would be quite deleterious to life as we presently know it, because the repair mechanisms that we know of for taking care of that damage would have to be better than the repair mechanisms associated with our radiation-resistant, desiccation-resistant microbes on Earth. The mudstones that we see, the fine-grained rocks that we investigated at Yellowknife Bay when we discovered the environment with the neutral waters, that very fine-grained stuff is not good for organisms that come in later and colonize the rock. Remember that stuff about you need the sufficient pore space to hold the nutrients and to diffuse away the waste products. We have had life in fine-grained environments on Earth on tidal flats. So that's not a total showstopper, but it doesn't preserve the kinds of things that we would like to see in ancient rocks as evidence of a habitable environment because of this very tight pore space. The radiation environment that exists now has probably existed for a long time because evidence from atmospheric measurements suggests that the atmosphere was lost pretty early. So it's a tough place if we want to call it a habitable environment. Is it an impossible place? I don't think so. I don't think we can invoke a deep biosphere, which would be a topic for a whole other talk. The reason why is because how would we get down there to measure it? But I think we could think of some other reasons to invoke a shallow subsurface biosphere, because remember, Mars doesn't have plate tectonics. So if you want to recycle materials, exchange materials between the surface and the subsurface, you can't go too deep or you don't have a way to get the stuff exchanged. So if I were going to Mars as a human, I'd really want to go somewhere where I could get to the shallow subsurface and have a look there. Now, all this being said, we've looked at just a tiny amount of Mars. Can we say something definitive about the entire planet? No. So take everything I am saying with a large grain of salt. It would be disingenuous of me not to tell you that I don't think it's a good environment on the surface right now. I've only seen the surface at Gale Crater. This is my first mission. So I think as we continue to look and we continue to keep in mind my supreme optimism that there will be things on Mars that we can learn from this planet, then we might get a little bit closer to understanding what makes a habitable planet. Now, before I just totally turn this over to you to have at me with questions, I want to give you these URLs where you can get some information. Curiosity has a Twitter account too. I couldn't reasonably fit it on here and make you be able to read all these, but you can Google that and it'll come up easily enough. So these three at the top are good interactive sites. There's plenty of imaging sites. There's the USGS tracking where we are every day. And then there's, of course, every planet has its own Facebook page, including, I don't know if the newest one has its own Facebook page yet, but we'll get there. So the floor is yours.
Okay, you had said something before about the humidity in the sand dune, and is humidity caused by something other than water? I was confused by that term and that presence of water on the surface. Thanks.
Sure. So the question is, I mentioned humidity, and Mars has a relative humidity. There's not zero water on Mars. There's some water vapor. And the question is, in temperature and pressure phase space in a chemical diagram, can you get water condensing on Mars in the right conditions? And there was a paper published 2 years ago now that said that at Gale Crater, it is possible you could reach those conditions in a very briny fluid. So it is possible that there is a relative humidity cycle on the ground. We've certainly traced the relative humidity in the atmosphere over time with the Rover Environmental Monitoring Station, otherwise known as REMS. And so we don't know the answer about the dunes yet, but we do have relative humidity on Mars, and to my knowledge, no one has ever applied that term to something other than water.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. It seems important to determine what we call life. In other words, does it have to be protoplasm and how much of that? Okay, so if you take a step back to the mineral aspect, is there anything that indicates an adaptable situation where certain minerals have flourished, or the combinations, like we got different combinations and the calcium came in and things like that? Mm-hmm. So is there anything in the environment that shows any indication of that type of adaptability to the situation, therefore possibly structuring something more complex later on?
Great question. So I'm going to repeat it. And the question was, do we see any signatures of mineralogy that would give us some indication that the environment has become more or less habitable, or has not hosted life, if I may paraphrase you?
Or adapted.
Or adapted. So if you're standing here in this auditorium, you probably know some of the work of my old mentor at the Geophysical Lab, Bob Hazen, who has published on a theory that the complexity of the array of minerals evolves over time and is affected by life. I wouldn't know what to look for in that regard on Mars because we have such a small environment on Mars. I will say that the mineralogical diversity on Mars, and this is my opinion speaking as a mineralogist, has been more boring than I hoped it would be.
But
So-
even temperature or light, any indication of any flux?
Of metastable minerals that can form when it gets cold, but not when it gets warm.
Yeah.
We haven't seen anything like that with Curiosity. That doesn't mean it's impossible. What it means is that what we have to do to drill a hole with abrasion, so it's a powdering drill, so it's destructive. Sieve that stuff so it's less than a certain micron size, so it gets through the screen in our X-ray diffractometer, and it takes a while, so by the time the sample gets into our X-ray diffractometer to measure it, a lot of time has passed, it's thermally cycled, and we might not know it if it had been a metastable mineral earlier. So don't give up hope on that, it's a great idea.
How has your study in music and music composition influenced or affected your work in interplanetary science? And if it hasn't, what role does music play in your life now?
So I'm a firm believer that everything is related to everything else. And everything that I learned in music theory, I had already figured out intuitively by ear, and everything I studied in electronic music laid the groundwork for me to understand spectroscopy. And so it's been extremely relevant in ways that I would never have predicted. But most importantly, it keeps me sane. And I do have a recording studio in the basement, and I still sing, mostly not for public consumption anymore.
You mentioned a number of physical characteristics of planets that seem to be favorable for the development of life, like a magnetic field, plate tectonics, an atmosphere, a large moon. As we look at planets outside the solar system, how good are we at figuring out if they have these characteristics? Obviously, we can see how far away they are from the sun and how big they are. That seems fairly straightforward. But these other physical characteristics, can we measure them?
Fabulous question and an important one. And so the answer is yes and no. So the things that we would want to know that tell us how dynamic the chemical environment is, if you look at a place that's very distant, and basically you might have discovered it by occultation, or maybe you could image it with a pixel, you don't have a lot of bandwidth at which to throw resources to make these measurements. So we talk about such things all the time. What would we measure? Obvious things have to do with what we define as a habitable zone. Is the planet of a size and of a distance from its source of stellar energy that it could potentially have liquid water? Is it near other bodies that could potentially play into dynamics? Things like were proposed by Sagan a very, very long time ago, basically piggybacking off of James Lovelock, when we talked about disequilibrium mixtures of gases and so forth in atmospheres. It's really hard to see stuff like that in a very distant object just because, you know, the one pixel. So as we get better technology and we get our assets in more distant positions so that they can have a broader array of tools, then we can ask some of the more specific chemical questions.
Thanks for a great talk.
You're welcome.
So if all the other improbable pieces were actually possible, could Matt Damon actually have grown potatoes on Mars?
Okay, Jim Green, who is sort of my boss, is going to kill me. So here's the deal. The OxyClean is bad news for potatoes. And the premise is an interesting one. You need a matrix to grow stuff in. So on Earth, when we use hydroponics, we just use a screen as a matrix, and we can throw in some microbes, we can throw in some inorganic nutrients. On Mars, you do have a lot of the inorganic nutrients that you might need, including things like phosphorus and potassium. The problem right now, as I see it, for the potatoes is the chlorine, the oxychlorines, which are a challenge. So you would have to find a way to mitigate that so that you would not be so far. Life tends to do these redox chemistry reactions as it conducts its metabolic business. And so if you go way too far on one side or the other side, it becomes a challenging environment, both for fixing and liberating chemical species you need. The chlorine is a big problem. Could you do something with that dirt to make a growable soil? Maybe. We use the term soil loosely when we refer to Mars. On Earth, soil means something different because we have a large microbial content to it, and that microbial content does some of the work of the chemistry for us. We would have to be able to get the right mixed layered consortium to create horizons in soil to really get going good. Would that be possible? I think it would be possible. We just didn't see those steps in a 2.5-hour movie, which I loved, by the way.
That was a lovely talk, but I would like to draw you back to the beginning. You actually played it pretty safe. You started with some very interesting talks about the importance of the size of the planet, but you only stuck your neck out on what you could see from curiosity. So I'd like to draw you back to the beginning. What about the size of the planet? What about some of these mega considerations, not just the bottom-up pieces from your own observations?
I'll be glad to do that, and the caveat is it will be pure speculation because I'm not an astronomer, but here are some of the things I'm thinking about. One of the things that is really important and central to the formation of an atmosphere is the composition of the interior. Is it stratified? Is it actively convecting? And what is the rate of degassing? The rate of degassing has to be such that you have the right set of light elements on the surface at the right moment to be able to form atmosphere. So in that regard, a planet that's a gas giant, like Jupiter, is really tough for liberating light elements that are of the right chemical mix to support life as we know it. Now, there are other problems that are associated with size. Again, speculating here. So we talk about the asteroid belt. Was it a protoplanet that couldn't quite get together due to the gravitational effects of Jupiter? What did that do to the amount of debris that was available to impact Mars relative to the other debris? I don't know the answer to that stuff, but when you think about the sizes of planets and the exchange of material from the surface to the interior and going the other way, I think those are key features. And one of the things that I work with a group of people at Goddard to do is to think about what sorts of interior chemistry might we use to model different mixes of atmospheres that would appear at planets of a particular size. So stay tuned for more information on that from people who really know. I'm just kind of a hack in that regard.
Yeah, I saw one station or a place called Cumberland.
Mm-hmm.
So how are these names chosen? Is it geographical similarity, or who decides on that?
Great question. The question is, how do we get these names for places on Mars? So there are two answers to that. The formal naming, we use U.S. Geological Survey convention. We have quadrangles that are named after a specific set of options. And we have naming conventions for example, Mount Sharp is an informal name, which we persist in using because we were calling it that informally from the get-go. Its real name is Aeolus Mons. The names that we have available to us when we pick a target that we want to drill or that we want to zap with the laser-induced breakdown spectrometer are from a list that is generated, made available. So when we were looking at Yellowknife Bay, for example, the quadrangle that we used to map out features where the rover went was based upon the area in Canada from which we stole Yellowknife. And so we have to have towns of a certain size or less and rivers of a certain size in a town of a certain size or less and so forth. And then we can pick the names from those, but we have to follow the rubrics for using those. We can't just randomly pick one. And when something happens, someone dies, or we want to propose a memorial name, that's a big deal. It isn't done willy-nilly. It has to go through a vetting process.
You said about the plate tectonics. There are no plate tectonics in Mars, unlike the Earth. And
sadly, no.
is that the reason there's no life there? Because they say the plate tectonics is the reason where there's a magma and the volcanic, which keeps the Earth still lively and lifeful.
Great question. I don't know the answer. I will tell you, though, that I think it goes the other way. I think that the interior temperature and the ability to get convection cells going, this is my earlier training at the geophysical lab, listening to all these talks about things I didn't understand at the time. The ability to get these things moving and the flow of heat, those things are what makes the colder, relatively colder, drier skin break off and move around on the top. So it really has to do with the thermal regime of the interior. And that's a very intuitive question because plate tectonics play a role on Earth in recycling in our biogeochemical cycles and certainly in our inorganic chemical cycles.
Hi, great talk, thank you. This is just a follow-up question about habitability of potential of planets. I know a lot of planets have been discovered recently, especially by the Kepler mission. Some of them are in what's called the Goldilocks zone. If you could just tell us a little bit about, is there any possibility of us finding out any more information about anything discovered there at any time soon, or is that really not, or that's really not possible?
So I'm going to answer it in two ways. So in terms of the release of information, as soon as the information is acquired and analyzed by the scientists, they publish it because they need the publications, and then it gets released to the public. And so it is possible to get all the data as it is published. That's first. The second part of the question, which has to do with can we really measure the stuff we need to measure to be able to make a judgment about whether the planet has high habitability potential? We don't have the capability to do that with very distant objects. Just because they're so distant, we don't have sufficient pixels to transmit that information back to us. So a planet will be so tiny as a distant object that we really won't be able to observe it well until we figure out ways to get an object that can measure it closer to it. So stay tuned, don't give up.
All right, well, I know other people have questions, and you have an email address. I just want to say thank Pamela again in a moment, but I want you to get home safely tonight, whatever it's doing out there, so be very careful, please, and thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.